We're live? We're live. It's good to know. You feel alive this morning? It's a brand new year. It is the beginning of one year and the end of a quarter of talking about unsung heroes. That's a very sad thing for all of us, but we have no more left, which is certainly not the case. But this is the last class that we're going to have on unsung heroes. I'm going to go ahead and put a plug in. Starting next week, Daryl Berry will be in this auditorium teaching class on the Gospel of Matthew. And over in the Family Life Center, we'll have Mission Possible, exploring our purpose and mission as defined by the Bible with Dennis Kroll starting next week. So, I know no one teaches quite like I do, but we've got new options starting next week, and hopefully some great ones that we can all capitalize on and continue to learn and grow and live and be a family together. So I appreciate the opportunity I've had this quarter, and for all of you guys and your thoughts and helping along with this series. Hope it's challenged you to think a little bit about some characters in the Bible that we don't tend to give much credence to. This morning, we're really going to, if you're visiting this morning, it's a perfect day to visit, because we're actually just going to kind of recap everybody that we've come through this week, this quarter, I should say. We've talked about, we had 11 different classes, 12, one that kind of broke into two parts. We talked about, 323 different people, if you really want to get technical about it. I'm counting all the 300 that fought with Gideon together there. But we've talked about a lot of people, and we've talked about hopefully some people that we look at a little bit differently now. Some people who did the most commonplace of things in a lot of instances, but God used them, and they were allowed God to use them in ways that impacted and made impacts larger than they certainly could have anticipated, larger than anybody could have anticipated. And we talked about all these people with the underlying thought in the back of our minds that this is not just some kind of fantastical Bible story. This is possible for us today. When we allow God to truly utilize us, when we allow ourselves to be a vessel for God's will in our life, when we allow ourselves to put away all the excuses that we have for not doing what we know we ought to do, God can really do amazing things. And I hope you believe that. I hope that you're open to seeing that in your lives. I hope that, Tim said this morning, I'm not a huge resolution guy, but there's no time like the present to make a change. And certainly starting off a new year, there's no time like right now to make a commitment to allow God to use you and to commit to doing the hard things for God, the things that maybe don't necessarily get recognized, but make a big impact. And it's an important thing. We started this class off, I'd ask if anybody could remember, but I'm not going to put you on the test. We were all up late last night. How many of you guys actually made it to midnight last night? Wow, that's actually pretty impressive. You guys don't have 2.5-year-olds in your houses, I'll tell you. Yeah, we were up after midnight for quite a while, but yeah, we'll try to get some sleep beforehand. I won't put you on the spot this morning, but we did start off this series a long time ago now, it seems like, in the book of Judges, talking about a judge that's really only referenced in 2 different instances, named Shamgar. Anybody remember the story of Shamgar? Tim does. We would hope. Was anybody else paying attention 3 months ago? Anyone? Shamgar. We got a few hands. Shamgar, not so famously, was a judge of Israel, saved Israel by what? What was his big lumbering weapon of choice? An ox goad, which we talked about was probably an 8 to 9 foot long pole with a hook on the end of it that you'd use to goad an ox. Anybody's choice of weapon to go into battle? No, it wouldn't be our first choice. But when we talked about Shamgar, the idea that as Christians, we're armed with a lot more than we give ourselves credit for. We've got a lot more going for us than we really stop to contemplate. And when we allow ourselves to be utilized and to have faith in the fact that God has given us what we need for the battle at hand, for the task at hand, we can utilize something very ordinary and do something very extraordinary with it. With one ox goad, Shamgar struck down 600 of the Lord's enemies, and he too saved Israel. That's a pretty amazing feat. We don't talk about it a lot. I'm sure that if Hollywood were to make a movie about it today, it would be quite entertaining. But the fact of the matter is, Shamgar didn't use his lack of weaponry or even his lack of training as a soldier as an excuse to allow God's people to be put into servitude and to be mistreated. He stood up. He said no more. He used what he had and was equipped with and allowed God to use him. And God used him in a mighty way. What do we learn from Shamgar? Does anybody in here have a memory this morning of that class or something that stuck out about Shamgar's story that we can all glean from today? Maybe not. Maybe it's early. I get it. Anyone? We'll keep going through the list here, and hopefully at some point some of this will jog some memories. But the idea being that, go ahead, yeah.
That Deborah included him in her song that she sang.
What's that?
Deborah included Shamgar in the song that she sang.
Deborah did that. That's the second instance that we see of Shamgar in Scripture, is that Deborah mentions him in the song that she sang. And in her song, she says, in that time, in the time of Deborah, in the time of Shamgar, when there were no warriors to be found in all of Israel. Well, he may not have been a warrior, but ultimately he was. He may not have been classically trained, but he was willing to step up and to be used in a mighty way. And certainly we can look around, and the applications today are there for us. We can look around in the world that we live in and see a lack of a godly representation of people. And we could, if we wanted to be really critical, we could say, the church is really dropping the ball. The Lord's people need to be more fervent, more loud, more brash about that. Well, who are the Lord's people? Who's the church? We have an opportunity to stand up and be utilized. So what is it that stops us from doing that? We're not unique in that. It's happened all throughout the Bible. It's happened all throughout history. But what is it going to take for us as God's chosen people, as God's people, saved and saved through the sacrifice of the Lord, God's Son, to give us this amazing opportunity to spend eternity with Him? What is it going to take, if not that, to empower us to stand up and to share and to be a Shamgar, to take a stand for God when it's uncomfortable, when we feel ill-equipped? The opportunity is there. So the question that we really have to ask ourselves as we start this new year is, what excuse are we counteracting that with to stop us from being used in a mighty way by God? And so we talked about Shamgar, and I hope we learned something from him. After Shamgar, we went to one of my favorite characters in the Bible. We talked about Caleb. Does anybody remember what we learned from Caleb? I know we're still deep diving here. Anybody have any thoughts on Caleb this morning? We took a vow of silence for New Year's resolutions this year. I saw you raise your hand back there. Are you taking it back down?
Yeah, no.
All right.
So Caleb was one of the braver ones when they went over to look at the land, to look at the enemies. They came back and said, "Oh no, we can't defeat them." But Caleb said, "Yes, we can." I believe it was Caleb and Joshua.
Caleb and Joshua. That's absolutely
yes, we
right.
Can. And so, with that, they went into battle.
We know who's taking notes this class. I appreciate that. Absolutely. Caleb was one of the 12 spies. Caleb and Joshua were the only 2 spies that came back when the Israelites went in and looked at the promised land before they came in. Yes?
Yeah, I just think of Caleb as a man of courage.
Of courage, yes.
Courage,
When we talked about Caleb, we mentioned the fact that he was a converted Jew in reality. He was half Gentile. And so there was probably some stigma that was attached to that at some way or another. We talked that the name Caleb means dog-like, and we talked about how it would fit him because he was very loyal. He was 100% loyal and committed, and not just in the moments and the highs and the good times of the Israelites, because Caleb saw the extreme highs and he also saw the extreme lows. Caleb is one of two of his generation that saw the promised land, which is an amazing thing to think about. Caleb saw Israel at its, well, maybe not its worst, but certainly close to it, at its very low. And he also saw it as very high, and he ends up his life fighting giants in the mountains to reclaim the land that God had promised to him. And God did make a promise specifically to him. When we talked about Caleb, we mentioned that he was one of two people that God said, consider Caleb my servant. He called Caleb his servant. It's a powerful thing. Caleb lived a lifetime of loyalty and faithfulness. Not just when it was convenient for him, certainly for a large chunk of his life, for a good 40 years of it, it was not convenient. It was difficult. It was hard. But Caleb saw through that. He believed and professed that God kept him alive so that he could be used to fight the Lord's enemies. What's keeping you alive this morning? When we think about Caleb, when we think about all the unsung things that he did in his lifetime, all the things that he endured, certainly we've all been through trials and tribulations, but none of us have pitched a tent in a desert for 40 years. None of us have endured watching everybody in our generation die out in the wilderness because of their own, folly. Caleb endured a lot, and he kept his eyes on the prize. He believed that God kept him alive just to fulfill his purpose, to fight for God. So what's keeping us alive? How quick are we to turn our backs on God in the bad times? Caleb gives us an example of a lifetime of faithfulness. Yes, Ronnie.
No, they just point out to me the commitment that Caleb had to the belief that God would do what he said to do.
Absolutely.
And how we likewise should look to that as an example of how many times God has came through for us when we depended and trusted him. And he'll continue to do that to this very day. He's looking for men to stand up for that belief.
Yeah, he's absolutely looking for people to stand up for those beliefs. I always think it's interesting about Caleb. He was from the tribe of Judah. He had a heart that was truly just in tune with God's will, and it always strikes me as interesting that when the Savior comes, he came from the same tribe. Caleb had plenty of opportunities in his life to come up with excuses. He had plenty of people who were ready to make excuses for him. He had 10 spies that were ready to make excuses for him. But he and Joshua weren't going to put up with that because they knew that the God they served was greater than anything that this earth could offer or that this earth could throw on their way. How committed are we to that? And really the question is, how committed are we to really recognizing that, to understanding that? Because if we really understood it, we would behave a lot differently, I think. Caleb teaches us that not just in the high moments, but in the low moments as well, our God is worth following. Our God is worthy of our loyalty and our adoration and our servitude. He's worthy of our faithfulness. And he requires it. He demands it. And so we talked a lot about Caleb, and I think there's a lot for us to learn from Caleb in our lives. After Caleb, we had a really interesting class and discussion, informative discussion for me even, on the centurion. Centurion who had to recap the story real quick, he had a servant who has fallen ill. It's a servant he cared a great deal about, and he knew and had heard of a man named Jesus. He knew and heard of a man named Jesus because even as a Gentile, he had an appreciation for the God of Israel. So much so that he, out of his own pocket, funded the building of the temple where he was. And so the other Jews knew this man to be a guy who appreciated God. And so when he had this servant that fell ill, he had heard of Jesus. He knew about Jesus. He knew that Jesus was in the area. He went to those local Jews and he said, hey, can you guys approach this Jesus who's out here healing to come and heal my servant? Which we talked about was probably a little bit of a kick in the pants for those Jews who weren't quite sure how to feel about Jesus themselves, but because this man had done so much for them, they went out and tried to get Jesus. He sends his servant to go and approach, and he tells the servant, if we recall, he tells the servant, you know what? I recognize that Jesus has authority. I don't need him to come and lay his hands. All I need for him to do is say, be healed. In fact, I'm not worthy to have this man come and do this for me. He's got the authority to do that. If he wills it, it'll be done. Now, that's an amazing, amazing amount of faith. But that is a faith that is built on the fact that this man, who was not one of God's chosen people at the time, but who very much was, has this idea and this understanding and this recognition of God's authority over everything. How closely do we allow ourselves to recognize God's authority in our lives? And it's an interesting thought, because we know ultimately and intellectually he's in control. And we know ultimately and intellectually that his will be done. And a lot of times we use that as an excuse and say, you know what, God's will be done, so maybe it doesn't necessarily take me to be involved. Is that the attitude and the mindset that we should be taking? Is that the attitude and the mindset that this centurion took? He recognized that authority. And he respectfully approaches in a way that highlighted the fact that he understood that God is in control. And he was willing to make himself less. He was a man of stature. He was a man that commanded respect. He was a Roman centurion. He probably could have had Jesus brought in front of him and forced to do it, or at least thought he could have. But he doesn't go that way at all. We don't even see it, that he's tempted to do that. He understands that Jesus has authority. He understands something that even the most pious of the Jews really didn't understand about Jesus, and that was that he spoke for God, that he was, in essence, God, that he had the authority of God. And the recognition of God's authority over everything is something that I think we can all learn from, and certainly need to learn from. What would your life look like? How would it differ? How would it be different in 2023 if you had some kind of Saul-esque scales fall from your eyes and you really saw the authority of God in action? Would it change the way you live your life? Would it change the choices that you make? Guess what? God has the authority. God has the authority, and not only does he have the authority, he is asking us to actively recognize that. He is requiring of us, as we follow him, to understand that and to live our lives according to that, and to put him in first place, to put him above everything else, because he is God. He is the creator. So we learned that from the centurion. And an amazing story of what certainly at the time was not one of God's people understanding God far better than those who profess themselves to be God's people. And there's a lesson in that for us too, as we share with others, to recognize that the authority of God is something that should be more apparent than it is. And it's certainly important for us to keep that in mind. After we talked about the centurion, we went on to the following week to talk about the lone apostle that we talked about. Does anybody remember? James, that's right, James the Less. James the Lesser. And we talked about, with James, the value of a life of service to God, and the fact that when it comes to being, just to follow the analogy, to being less, God can use that to mean so much more. We talked about James a lot, even though the Bible doesn't say a whole lot about James. We also talked about James's mother, a woman who raised James and who was also a faithful and avid follower of Jesus, who was there at several times when Jesus, including his death and at the resurrection, a woman who was faithful in her life and who raised a faithful son. A woman who was willing to make herself a servant for Jesus to allow for his comfort to be paramount in her time with him, because she recognized that being a servant and making herself less meant that he could be more. And when we talk about the Lord's church and we talk about being unsung heroes, that resonates on so many different levels. When we make ourselves less, really, aren't we doing what Jesus commanded? Isn't that the epitome of what Jesus shares with his followers in the upper room in the Last Supper when he's with them? To make themselves less? Jeannie?
But making ourselves less doesn't mean we're not important and needed in the church. Making ourselves less means willingness to do whatever it takes and to have the humble attitude of serving versus, well, I'll let them do it because they can do it better.
Yes.
It's a difference in attitude of humility versus giving yourself an excuse to get out of the picture.
Yes, that is 100% true. When we talk about making ourselves less, we're not talking about making ourselves scarce, which we can very often do the mental gymnastics to make that thing. Hey, it's time to put the chairs away. Well, you know what? I'm probably in the way. Let me get out of the way instead of grabbing a couple of chairs and stacking them up, right? We can make ourselves less or we can make ourselves scarce. When we talk about making ourselves less, it is an important distinction to know that we're talking about putting the well-being and the needs of others ahead of ours so that we can serve. And to be a servant, to truly allow ourselves in humility and in humbleness to put somebody else's needs ahead of ours and to serve others is the epitome of what Christ did when he came to this earth. Why did he come here and endure the things that he did? Because he loved us. How do we show in this body that we care and love about each other better than to put the needs of each other ahead of our own? Isn't that the whole idea of this community? Isn't that the whole idea of the body working together in harmony? For us to be able to call ourselves the family, the children of God, it requires us to not necessarily be the siblings that are fighting over the pecking order, but to be the autonomous body that is all working together for the same purpose, to lift up God. And ultimately, by making God the top of everything, it becomes a lot easier in that perspective to put everything else lower, to allow ourselves to be humble, to approach the throne of God and approach each other as children of God as the same family. To hold each other in the same regard that we do ourselves, because we're all in this together and we're all hopefully working towards the same end. And if we can't get along here, I got news for you. Eternity is going to be really awkward, because that's the whole end goal, is that we're going to spend forever together. And so we learned that through James the Less. We learned that through his mother. And we talked a great deal about that. All right. After that, we went on and we talked about Barnabas. We talked a pretty good deal about Barnabas. Does anybody remember or want to recap the story of Barnabas or the message of Barnabas? I feel like I'm doing all the talking this morning here.
Yeah. Barnabas, he was an encourager.
He was.
And he was one who, when I think Paul refused to take Mark with him, Barnabas took Mark along with him.
He's a peacemaker for sure. Yeah.
So he was an encourager.
He was a man, his name actually is Joseph. He's a man who was known by his nickname, which was the son of encouragement. We talked a great deal in this class when we talked about Barnabas about the importance of encouragement. Anybody still feel like they have been sufficiently encouraged for the rest of their lives? They don't require any more? Encouragement's an important part of our walk with God. It's a tremendous part of our walk with God. And the power of encouragement is something that we all intellectually understand that, but how often do we put it into practice? And quite frankly, when we do put it into practice, how often is it us conscientiously trying to be encouraging? You don't get the sense that Barnabas had to sit down and make himself write a letter or do something. It exuded from him. It just was who he was. He couldn't help but be encouraging. And I would argue that was because he truly understood the glory that we have access to through the gospel of Christ. He understood that. He got it. And we could all stand to live a life a little bit more like Barnabas, where we just exude the joy that comes along with being able to be called and being considered a child of God. That's an amazing thing. Should we be encouraged by that? Should we be encouraging others through that? 100%. So what is it that stops us from doing that? Because it is very easy. It's extraordinarily easy to lose sight of that. Too easy. And that's a problem. That's a problem because, we always talk about the spiraling down. You start on that pathway and it's a slippery slope, and you find you can get in a real negative place really quickly. We need Barnabases in our lives, yes. We need to be Barnabases in our lives. We need to be that person, and we need to share in that. We need that to be like iron sharpening iron. When you leave this building, if you leave here unencouraged, then we've all failed. We've all failed. So,
I think that ability to encourage starts with gratitude. And
Okay.
I think that's something that we just have to be really intentional about, is
Yeah.
thinking about how we ourselves have been blessed. And there's not a person, here that doesn't have a much better life probably than, 80% of the world, or I don't know what the stats would be, but the point is that even us, when we are in lean times, still have so much more. And we have each other, and we have a body, and we have a means to have our needs met, which is just, when you think about it, it's just
Yeah.
so mind-blowing.
It's
just
overwhelming,
amazing.
yeah.
It is overwhelming, but I think it's hard for us to be encouragers if we haven't really taken stock of what we have been given.
I guess, it's great perspective to keep. Like, the fact of the matter is, when we really stop and gather the perspective of what we've been blessed with, it's easier to be encouraging. And so what is it going to take for us to keep that focus, to hold on to that, and to really, instead of aspiring to be Christ-like, transition ourselves into acting like Christ, into allowing ourselves to be changed that way. Yes?
There's two sides to encouraging.
Absolutely.
There is the giving, which is what we're talking about, but it is also in receiving.
Yep.
Because I know that this has been a year of needing encouragement in my family with Bert and I, and you have to be open. Sometimes you're just too sick to have somebody come over and do something, but you do have to, your heart has to be receiving and opening to have encouragement. And sometimes we close ourselves off and we feel bad, and so we shut ourselves out, and we can't do that.
Yeah.
We just can't.
We definitely, you're right. There's two sides to encouraging. You have to be receptive to it too, because too often we can buy into the lie that whether it's we don't believe that we're worthy of it, or whether it's too overwhelming for us at the time. But the fact of the matter is, God wants us to be encouraged. He's given us good news. It should be encouraging. And so when we're closing ourselves off to those aspects, those elements of encouragement, we're not living our life to the fullest potential. Another important thing to point out is, Barnabas being encouraging didn't always mean that he necessarily agreed with everything that he was talking to, the people he was talking to. He and Paul had some arguments, but you know what? Through all of it, they didn't allow any of those separations to take place. Didn't allow any of those separations to force them apart long term. They came back around, they reconciled things, and Barnabas helped Paul reconcile things with some other brothers too. It was a continuing, and encouragement is a continual effort. And we can't just say, all right, I've got encouraging down, I'm going to move on to the next thing. It doesn't work that way. It has become a continual practice, a continual part of what we do as Christians. And so we learned that from Barnabas. After we talked about Barnabas, we went on and we talked about the story of the lepers who were healed by Jesus. And we talked about the one leper who returned. We speculated a little bit, because we have to a little bit in this story, as to what maybe some of the reasoning the other 9 didn't come there. We talked about that story. We talked about all of the different kind of things that we could think of that would perhaps detract from us wanting to go back and give that gratitude to Jesus. But we did talk specifically about that one leper who went back to Jesus and who thanked him. Who kind of threw himself at his feet and thanked him and recognized the tremendous new lease on life that he had received because of the grace of God. And certainly with that, we looked at a spirit of thankfulness and gratitude, which is of the utmost importance for us as Christians. Nobody has had a greater price paid for them than everybody. Think about that for a second. And the fact that you recognize that or don't recognize that should be the difference in how you live your life. But so often we profess to recognize that and live like the people who don't recognize it. And in this story, so do 90% of the people. We need to be part of that 10%. We need to be the people who recognize that and who live our lives just in an awe-inspired bubble of thankfulness, of gratitude, because that will change the way that you see everything. That is a paradigm-shifting realization. It makes being encouraging a lot more easier. But the fact that when we recognize the tremendous price that was paid for us, and were everyone else in the world perfect, it still would have been paid for us individually, because we serve a God who has that tremendous amount and ability to love us despite the fact that we know ourselves to be pretty unlovable at times. Myself included. I know, it's shocking. But that leper recognized that, and he had a spirit of thankfulness and a spirit of gratitude that I think we can all learn from. I think, in part, that story is included in the Bible because God wants us to recognize that. And God wants to remind us of the fact that He's done everything for us. And it's far too easy for us to forget that. So we have to remind ourselves not to forget that. We've got to go through that paradigm shift. After we talked about that leper, we jumped into the story of the 300 soldiers who fought with Gideon. We talked about blind faith in overwhelming circumstances. And maybe for the first time in a couple of weeks when we talked about that, we could kind of relate to the fact that we sometimes feel like we're facing enormous odds. Sometimes in our lives, when we think about in regard specifically about sharing God's word, about being bold messengers for Christ, we feel like we're facing overwhelming odds. The fact of the matter is, we've been equipped with everything that we need, and God, I believe in many ways, has us in those situations in a dare to be great scenario. He's pushing us. He is asking us to make that stand, and for Him to show us that He's got our back, that He has won the war, and these battles that are in the way, we can win those too if we'll allow Him to work through us. We talked a lot about those 300 soldiers. We also talked about several of the soldiers at the beginning of the story who admitted to their fear and went home, were called back out when the battle turned. Were given a chance at redemption to go out and fight for God. And we also talked about the importance of when we fall short in our duties as soldiers for Christ, God still gives us opportunities for redemption. He is still seeking for us to be part of what His plan for us is. And so we shouldn't ever forget that. We shouldn't allow ourselves, when we fall short, to get so down on ourselves that we don't allow ourselves to bounce back. And it's important for us to remember that. And we learned that through those 300 soldiers. The following week, we talked about two women in the Bible. We talked about the little maid who was instrumental in helping get her captor, really, who was leprous, to go see the prophet in Israel. And he was ultimately saved from his leprosy. And we know a little bit about that story. We talked about that at great length when we talked about that class. But we talk about that story a lot and forget the fact that this was a little girl who had been ripped away from her land and her people, who had every reason to stay silent and to think it justified to watch her captor, her master, die of this insidious disease. But she recognized that in blind faith that the power of God is worth sharing. And she shared the power of God with him, and it ultimately gave him a new lease on life. In that same class, we talked about the widow that Elijah sought to kind of hide out with for a while during a time of famine. And we talked about the fact that she was literally putting together her last bits of oil and flour to make a cake so that her son and her could eat it and then die. Lovely story. It's not the way you want to start off a new year. But the fact of the matter is, he asks her, hey, before you do that, make something for me. And she, in her faith, knowing that a man of God and being told by God that a man of God was coming to her, serves him first. And we know the story. The oil never ran out, the flour never ran out until the time came where they could be replenished, when the famine was over. And we talked about just the fact that she had, both of these women had a faith to share both the word and their resources, knowing that God could act in a powerful way, knowing that they could do something really small that would make a huge impact and that would continue to make an impact. And they not only knew that, but had the willingness to kind of put their money where their mouth was, put the lack of food where their mouth wasn't, to allow themselves to put themselves in serious positions of sacrifice for the benefit of somebody else, knowing that God could act in there, and he does. And so we see that kind of faith that to share not only the word, but to also share of their resources, despite all the overwhelming odds against them. And it should be inspiring for us. After that, we talked in week 9 about the unsung 10 in Colossians 2. We took 2 weeks to talk about these folks that Paul calls out by name. We don't have the time to go through all of them again here, but we noticed that when Paul was traveling from church to church, when he was sharing, all the things he was sharing, when he was really on a march towards his own death in a lot of ways, trying to make his way to Rome, trying to speak before the leaders of Rome, he was just very determined to stay in touch with those that he met along the way. And not only to stay in touch with them, but to prove that his time spent with them wasn't just him speaking, it was time with the Lord's body. And he remembered people. He spoke about individual people. He talked about those that were doing the work to have people in their homes. He talked about those that were delivering the message for him. He talked about those that were in need of prayer. He asked for updates on folks. And the fact of the matter is, if Paul could do this to one of the multiple churches that he planted and started along the way and remember all those things, what excuse can we have for looking around this auditorium and not knowing somebody here? What excuse? And I'm the chief of this. Believe me, I look around here and I couldn't tell you half the names in here. I shouldn't admit that. No. The fact of the matter is, look, we know each other, but we don't know each other. Not the way we should. Not the way family does. Isn't that what we are? Isn't that what we are striving to be? Paul made a point, and he's not making a point to prove that he knows people. He's genuinely concerned about these people. And he's sometimes admonishing, most times praising them for the work that they're doing and continuing to do. And all the works that they're doing and continuing to do are things that we would look at and say, yeah, somebody ought to do that. That's an important job. I think there's an application for us here, because as we sit here today, there are things happening that we all could look at and say, hey, somebody ought to do that. I know on Vital Concern, Dwayne Peterson's looking for 4 or 5 people to help with homeless feeding. I think it's 4 days out of the year. That shouldn't take multiple emails to fill. Somebody should do that. All right, well, good. LaMonica's volunteered. I mean, look, and this is not me, because I'm guilty of this too, but please understand me. This is not me wagging my finger in anybody's face. But I think that same week we put a clipboard up here asking for volunteers in Faith Lane. We still need volunteers in Faith Lane. Are we living this life together? Are we stepping up and doing the things that ought to be done? Or are we allowing ourselves to say, well, that's a good job for somebody to do. I'll encourage someone else to do it. Maybe sometimes the most encouraging thing is to step up and do it. Yes, Jeannie.
We have too many idols. We have been diverted from the mission.
Yeah.
And loving one another and serving Jesus and his mission. And we've got this and that and everything else that drives people crazy and diverted, and we have too many idols.
Somebody ought to do a sermon about that, Tim.
Yeah, got a good one.
But we learn a lot from that unsung Tim, because I really do believe it gives us a lot of insight into the body here at Bay Area. We've got a lot of unsung heroes here. We've got a lot of sung heroes here, but we also have a lot of, what we have probably the most of is opportunity. We have a tremendous amount of opportunity in this body. If we're not stepping up to fill those opportunities or not seeking out those opportunities, we're missing out. We're missing out on living our life to the fullest. We're missing out on being a hero for God, sung or unsung. We're missing out on fulfilling our job as Christians, as people who are professing themselves to be Christ-like. There's opportunity. And if you can't find it, ask somebody. But the fact of the matter is, there is opportunity, always. The question to ask yourself is there a heart willing to be used? And that's when we talk about everyone we've talked about in this course, throughout the course of this quarter, the people we talk about are people who have a willingness to be used. And so that's something to think about as we start a new year, as we start a new week, as we start a new day. Can you make the commitment to allow yourself to be used? 2 weeks ago, we talked about Ananias. We talked about his willingness in the face of danger, in the face of overwhelming fear, to obey God's call for him in the face of his enemies. We talked about Ananias, of course, was the man called upon by God to heal, convert, although I think the conversion had already kind of taken place when we talk about Saul of Tarsus, who became the Apostle Paul. He was a man that was out actively trying to persecute Christians, and Ananias gets the call from God saying, I need you to go see Saul of Tarsus. We talked a lot about, in fact, we talked about some people on death row and some people who have done some heinous crimes who had professed to have religious experiences in prison and found a form of salvation one way or another. And we talked about the skepticism that comes with that. We talked about the fact that Ananias, boy, if we were in his shoes, we could probably come up with a handful of excuses pretty quick on why Stephen would have given us a great one, on why maybe we shouldn't be so quick to go run and see this guy. Ananias was willing to do that, not without a little bit of question, but we understand that. Even though he had some questions, he never denied that he was going to do it. He allowed himself to be used by God in the face of his enemies. And we also pointed out that it's interesting that, when you think, why Ananias? The fact of the matter is his name means God's grace. And perhaps that meant something to Saul, who's receiving his sight once again and having a new lease on life. But where would the church be today had it not had Paul? And where would Paul be today if Ananias refused God's call for him? We know God still would have found a way, but it wasn't required because Ananias, when he was called, answered the call. And then last week, we talked about Samson's mother, a woman who had to keep all the rules, a woman who was really held to the rules, seemed a lot more stringently than certainly Samson was in his life, but was willing to establish and live her life according to a set of rules so that she could set the right example for her children. We talked a lot about the children in this church. We talked a lot about the direction that they need, the fact that it takes a village, the fact that we all have a responsibility for all of the souls of this body and beyond. How seriously are we taking that? We need to be living our lives in such a way that we are stepping up for every member of this church, from the nursery to the nursing home, and stepping up in a powerful way, living by the rules, yes, but also sharing and encouraging and doing all of the things that we've talked about through all these people. If we put it all together, we are looking at these 11, 12 individuals, and we are really creating the ultimate follower of Christ. And they're all relatively small things. But the fact of the matter is, it's the small things that God requires. It's the big things too. Don't get me wrong. He wants 100% of our hearts. But if we have and truly give him 100% of our hearts, all those small things will just naturally fall into place. What keeps us from doing that? And when we recognize the things that keep us from doing that, why aren't we better about getting them out of our lives? And maybe that's a question for another day. Maybe that's a question for another series. But the fact of the matter is, we need to hold each other accountable. We're in this together. And we need to be working together. You know, a lot of times when we look at the church, whether it's the church that's meeting here or meeting somewhere else, whatever it is, we can also pick things apart really quick. And sometimes we can talk about the fact that, it just feels like we're spinning our wheels. Well, the flip side of that is, you know what? The engine's running. Everything that, all the hundreds of things that have to take place to get us to go somewhere, like we can change the tires a lot easier than we can change the engine. When we're looking at our own lives and we feel like we're not getting any traction, well, are we spinning our tires, or do we need to work on our hearts? And the answer is probably always going to be yes, we need to do some work on our hearts. We need to be better about the small things and the big things. But the fact of the matter is, we're all working together to create and to accomplish something that is greater than any one of us could do individually. We need each other. We have to have each other. That's the way it was designed. We're all in this together, and together we can do the small things to become the great things. And then we can do the great things to really lift up and praise and give the adoration, the exaltation to our Creator that He deserves. That's the idea, at least. And I hope that as we start 2023, we're all on this together, that we're all on the same page, and we're all willing to be heroes for God. Sung or unsung, appreciated or unappreciated, we're willing to stand together to be family and to accomplish something greater together than we could ever accomplish on our own. Portia.
I think the overarching thing that I got from this whole thing is what Ms. Stowe says. It's about gratitude. And we think about all the things that God has done for us and gotten us through. And if you really just sit down and think about those things, or maybe even sit down and write out those things, all the things that God has done. When we think about the fact that it is a miracle that we get through just one day with all the things that are trying to kill us throughout the day, you don't even realize it. I mean, if you drive home, there's so many things that could take you out. And it's a miracle that we make it from, 12 a.m. to 11:59 p.m. every day. And it's just, how grateful am I going to be in this day that those people, those unsung heroes that you talked about, they just think about, God has done so much for me. I can do this one little thing. So when I go into my classroom in the day, I'm like, all right, what can I do that sets a standard for a kid that when everyone else is expecting them to do something stupid, then I'm expecting them to do something great.
Yeah.
And so it's just, it is really those small things that we can do every day that add up to big things, because we have to be super grateful for what God has done for us, because like I said, it's a miracle that we make it a day.
Yeah. Well, we serve a miraculous God. I appreciate your time. We went a little over this morning. Thank you for your time and your input throughout this series, and appreciate you all. Have a blessed day. Thanks.